They didn't have to pull the trigger to silence Malcolm X. They just had to make sure no one stopped the men who would. February 21st, 1965, Harlem. Malcolm walks into the Audubon Ballroom knowing the air feels wrong. His wife and children are there. The room is packed. The tension is thick. And in the middle of all that, there are police everywhere. Not two cops. Not a patrol car outside. Dozens. Then it happens. 3 gunmen rush the moment. A distraction. A blast. Then shots. Fast. Close. Relentless. Malcolm collapses in front of the people who loved him most. Here's the part that should make your stomach turn. Law enforcement was there with warning. They had advanced intelligence that an attack was coming. And when the shooting started, they weren't told to intervene. They were told to stand down, to watch, to let the killers move, to let them escape into the chaos, to let Malcolm die. And it wasn't because Malcolm was just a radical. It was because Malcolm was becoming something far more dangerous to the American system. He was building an international coalition, connecting Black Americans to revolutionary movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. He was exposing how capitalism and racism operate together as one global machine of extraction. He was teaching people how to break their mental chains, how to stop asking for freedom and start organizing power. That can't be televised into harmlessness. That can't be voted away. That can't be politely negotiated into nothing. So the state didn't need to assassinate him in the clean, cinematic way people imagine. It just needed to create the conditions where the assassination could happen, and then protect what mattered most: informants, agencies, reputations, and the illusion that justice is blind. After Malcolm was murdered, they slammed the case shut fast, framed 2 innocent men to seal the story, and buried everything that will blow it open. And for decades the world was told, case closed, until the truth started leaking through the cracks. In 2021, after those innocent men had spent 42 years in prison, Manhattan's district attorney admitted what people had been saying for generations. The FBI and NYPD withheld evidence. Evidence that could have helped the defense, exposed informants, and revealed what authorities knew before the bullets flew. They protected their machinery instead of seeking justice. This is the story they erased from your textbooks. Not just the murder, but the method, the message, the warning. And to understand why the system could not tolerate Malcolm X alive, you have to understand something even deeper. Malcolm Little didn't choose this war. This war found him before he could speak. May 19th, 1925, Omaha, Nebraska. Before Malcolm was even born, White Black Legion and Ku Klux forces were already circling his family like wolves. While Louise Little was pregnant, white night riders surrounded their home, rifle butts smashing windows, screaming threats meant to scare a baby out of the womb. The crime wasn't violence, it was dignity. Malcolm's father, Earl Little, was organizing for Marcus Garvey, teaching Black people they were descended from African greatness, that they deserved nationhood, pride, self-respect. In America, that kind of message was treated like a weapon. So the Littles fled to Lansing, Michigan, hoping distance could buy safety. It didn't. Malcolm was 4 years old when he woke in the dark to the smell of smoke and the roar of fire. Their house went up in flames, torched by white terrorists while the family slept. Earl stood outside with a shotgun, firing into shadows, chasing movement in the night, trying to protect 8 lives with one body. Police arrived after the destruction was complete. No serious investigation, no arrests, no urgency. just the unspoken lessons stamped into the ashes. This is what happens to black families who won't stay in their place. Then came September 28th, 1931. Earl Little's body was found on streetcar tracks. Authorities called it an accident, but the facts pointed to something uglier. He appeared to have suffered serious injuries before being placed on the tracks. The insurance company labeled it self-inflicted to deny benefits. Police treated it like routine so they wouldn't have to confront the obvious. Too many threats, too much organizing, too much pride. In that America, that was a death sentence. Louise Little fought for 7 years to keep 8 children together through the Depression. No safety net, no forgiveness, no mercy. And she refused the kind of help that came with strings, refused to raise her children to accept inferiority as normal, refused to bow her head just to survive. But the system doesn't just punish black men who stand tall. It punishes black women who refuse to break. When Louise wouldn't fold, they labeled her the problem. 1938. Authorities declared her legally insane, not because she was violent, not because she was incapable, but because she was uncooperative, because she wouldn't submit to the humiliations designed to make her family small. They committed her to Kalamazoo State Mental Hospital, where she would remain for 26 years. And then they did what power does best when it wants to erase the evidence. They dismantled the family. Her children were scattered across white foster homes and institutions like pieces of a case file being destroyed. Malcolm watched his world get taken apart step by step, like a controlled demolition, by a society that treated his mother's strength as madness and his father's pride as justification for elimination. By the time Malcolm was 13, he was living in Mason, Michigan, one of only a handful of black students in a predominantly white school. And this is the part that matters, because it destroys the lazy myth that Malcolm was always destined for the streets. He excelled, straight A student, top of his English class, elected 7th grade class president. For a moment, the American dream looked like a real doorway, not wide open, but maybe open enough for a brilliant black boy who worked twice as hard. Then came the conversation that shattered the illusion permanently. Malcolm walked into his English teacher's office, Mr. Ostrach, and shared his dream. He wanted to be a lawyer, and Mr. Ostrach didn't say, "That's ambitious, let's plan your path." He didn't say, "You can do it." He didn't say anything that a teacher is paid to say. He said Malcolm needed to be realistic. He told him a lawyer was an unrealistic goal for an N-word, and then, like he was being generous, he offered an alternative. Why don't you plan on carpentry instead? A child with perfect grades sat across from an educator hired to nurture potential, only to be told his intelligence didn't matter because his skin made him unqualified. That wasn't just an insult. It was a cage being welded shut. The message was crystal clear. Excellence won't save you. Obedience won't elevate you. Talent won't protect you. Your blackness is a ceiling you'll hit no matter how high you climb. Malcolm dropped out. And this is where the hypocrisy of America shows itself. The same society that crushes a black child's dreams will later point at the wreckage and call him a waste. They'll ask why he didn't just work harder, why he didn't just stay in school, why he didn't just make better choices, while pretending they didn't slam the door in his face. So, Malcolm went where the doors were open. First Boston, then Harlem. He became Detroit Red, numbers runner, hustler, street figure, moving through the underworld like a man who had already been told the legitimate world had no place for him. And the same people who helped create that reality shook their heads like it was just a personal failure. Then the state did what it always does. It waited for the moment it could legally put him in a cage. February 1946. Malcolm is 20 years old. He gets 8 to 10 years for burglary, when the average sentence for similar crimes was around 2 years. Why 4 times longer? Because in 1940s America, he hadn't only committed burglary, he had committed the real offense. He'd been dating white women. The burglary was the paperwork. The punishment was the message. Most men go to prison broken. Malcolm went to prison and found the one thing America had spent his whole life trying to keep from him, a path to liberation. He met John Elton Bimby, a self-educated prisoner who commanded respect, not through fear, but through sheer intellectual force. Malcolm watched how knowledge gave Bimby authority in a place designed to strip men of identity, and a revelation struck him like lightning. In a cage where physical freedom is restricted, the mind becomes the only territory that can't be confiscated unless you surrender it. So, Malcolm attacked education like it was survival. He copied the entire dictionary by hand, page after page, building a vocabulary until language became a blade. He read obsessively: history, philosophy, politics, religion. He devoured Carter G. Woodson and learned the architecture of stolen history, how black greatness was hidden to make black suffering seem natural. He studied African civilizations and discovered what the textbooks never taught. Timbuktu had universities in the 14th century while Europe was drowning in feudalism. He read W.A.B. Du Bois and began to understand the psychological warfare of double consciousness. He tore through Will Durant and realized how conquerors write history by erasing the conquered. Every book detonated another lie. Slavery wasn't a tragic accident. It was economics, calculated extraction, a machine designed to build white wealth on black labor. His ancestors weren't savages. They were mathematicians, astronomers, architects, builders of civilizations whose achievements had been buried so the theft could look justified. Then, in 1948, his brother Reginald brought him the teachings of the Nation of Islam. On the surface, the theology sounded extreme to outsiders, but underneath it was a psychological truth Malcolm could feel in his bones. Black people needed to stop begging white society for validation and reclaim their own power, identity, discipline, and spiritual independence. It wasn't just religion. It was a mental jailbreak. And when Malcolm finally walked out of prison, August 1952, Malcolm X stepped into the world, and Malcolm Little, the boy with the burned house, the dead father, the institutionalized mother, the shattered dream, stayed locked inside forever. He emerged with something America had spent centuries trying to prevent: a completely liberated black mind. And that kind of mind doesn't just change one man's life, it becomes contagious. In 1952, the Nation of Islam was small, roughly 400 members. By 1963, it had exploded to over 40,000. Malcolm was the engine, the voice, the lightning rod, the recruiter, the strategist, the public face. He became the national spokesman, the man the cameras couldn't ignore even when the establishment hated every word coming out of his mouth. His message didn't glide in softly, it hit like a brick. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. He demanded separation where integration meant humiliation. He demanded self-sufficiency where dependence meant control. He demanded community protection where the police meant occupation. And while Martin Luther King Jr. preached discipline through nonviolence, Malcolm preached discipline through readiness. Defend yourselves by any means necessary. That line became a weapon the media used to paint him as a monster. They played clips of "the white man is the devil" without explaining the 400 years of terrorism, theft, rape, lynching, and state violence that created that analysis. They framed him as hate because they were terrified of the power of his clarity. But even the people who despised him recognized something. Malcolm was magnetic, brilliant, unshakable. He spoke with the force of a man who had already lost everything that fear could take, and that's why the state never stopped watching him. By 1963, Malcolm had become more famous than Elijah Muhammad himself, and inside movements built on ego and authority, that's not just dangerous, it's explosive. Then the fracture opened. Malcolm discovered that Elijah Muhammad, the man preaching iron discipline, had been involved with multiple young secretaries and had fathered at least 6 children with them. The hypocrisy wasn't just personal, it was structural. It revealed that the purity being demanded of ordinary followers didn't apply to the leadership, but the deeper break went beyond scandal. Malcolm watched 4 black girls murdered in the September 15, 1963 Birmingham church bombing. He saw communities terrorized, protesters beaten bloody, the streets boiling. He was ready to mobilize, ready to move beyond speeches into action that protected black life. Elijah Muhammad said, "No, stay out of politics." The nation talked revolution but practiced submission, and Malcolm, who had transformed himself through discipline, could not tolerate a revolution that refused to fight. Then the moment came that gave the nation an excuse to put him in timeout. November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy is assassinated. When Malcolm said it was chickens coming home to roost, he wasn't celebrating death. He was calling out a pattern. Violence abroad always returns home. America had been involved in brutality across the globe, especially in places like the Congo, where Patrice Lumumba's death was tied to Western interference. Malcolm's point was that a nation living by violence shouldn't pretend to be shocked when violence visits its own doorstep. But the establishment didn't care about nuance, and Elijah Muhammad seized the opportunity. Malcolm was suspended immediately. Publicly, it looked like discipline. Privately, it was a warning shot. You are no longer protected. And Malcolm understood exactly what that meant. By early 1964, he was boxed in from every angle, attacked by media, monitored by government, and now isolated from the organization he had helped build. Then he made the decision that changed everything. March 8, 1964. Malcolm left the Nation of Islam. For most people, that would have meant peace, walking away from a toxic environment. For Malcolm, it was a death sentence. The nation treated defections like betrayal, and he was the biggest defector imaginable. But it was also freedom. Freedom to evolve beyond theological constraints. Freedom to build something bigger than a single organization. Freedom to speak as a revolutionary without permission. Only 1 month after breaking free, Malcolm delivered a speech that became a turning point in American history. April 12, 1964, Detroit. Over 2,000 people packed the room to hear him speak. The ballot, or the bullet. He framed 1964 as a crossroads. real voting rights and real power, or the inevitable rise of self-defense and revolution. But the most important part wasn't the threat, it was the evolution. Malcolm moved beyond civil rights into something that terrified the U.S. government far more: human rights. And that distinction matters. Civil rights keeps your complaint inside America's domestic courtroom, under American control, American judges, American limits, American delays. Human rights internationalizes the struggle. It takes the case to the world stage. It puts America in the dock in front of the United Nations. It turns U.S. racism into a global embarrassment, and Malcolm understood that embarrassment is pressure. Pressure creates consequences. Consequences create change. So Malcolm began connecting Black America to every anti-colonial movement rising worldwide: Kenya, Algeria, Cuba, Vietnam. He made it clear, this wasn't just about getting a seat at a lunch counter. This was part of a worldwide uprising against Western imperialism. And that's when the threat level changed. Malcolm preaching Black separatism could be contained inside U.S. borders. Malcolm turning Black struggle into an international human rights campaign could not, because once you expose the system globally, you threaten its legitimacy everywhere. The very next day after Detroit, Malcolm took the next step. April 13, 1964. He boarded a plane for the Hajj to Mecca. What happened there shattered the simplistic narratives people still tell about him. He prayed alongside Muslims of every race: blonde Europeans, dark Africans, Arabs, Asians, all equal before God. And he wrote that he had never seen sincere brotherhood practiced by all colors together, and that it forced him to rearrange his thought patterns. Critics called this softening. Wrong. Malcolm wasn't becoming harmless. He was becoming precise. He wasn't saying white skin was automatically the enemy. He was saying white power structures were. White supremacy wasn't just individual hatred. It was a system, an empire, a machine. That clarity made him capable of building broader coalitions while keeping his revolutionary analysis sharper than ever. And after Mecca, he didn't come home. He went deeper. From Mecca, Malcolm spent nearly 5 months moving through Africa like a man racing against a clock he could hear ticking. Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea, Senegal, Algeria. Not tourism, not spiritual sightseeing. This was revolutionary networking. He wasn't collecting stamps. He was collecting alliances. He met leaders who were reshaping the world, men who had thrown colonial governments off their backs and were building new nations from scratch. And when Malcolm sat with them, it wasn't as a celebrity. It wasn't as a curiosity. He positioned himself as something far more explosive, an international representative for the struggle of 22 million Black Americans inside the United States. He met Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He met Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and treated the meeting like sacred honor because Malcolm understood what Nkrumah symbolized: Black leadership and power, not begging, not petitioning, governing. He connected with Guinea's Ahmed Sekou Touré, a leader known for refusing Western control. These weren't photo ops. These were political relationships, linking the Black freedom struggle in America to anti-colonial movements that had already proven something the West didn't want Black Americans to believe: empire can be defeated. And the deeper Malcolm went into that world, the more warnings started coming back. Ghanaian intelligence intercepted credible assassination threats. Nkrumah reportedly urged Malcolm to stay, offering him protection and a role in building Pan-African solidarity from safety. But Malcolm refused. He chose to return to America because he believed the revolution had to be fought in the belly of the beast. He understood that if the U.S. empire was the head of the snake, then the work had to be done where its power lived. And when Malcolm returned, he returned transformed, not softened, not diluted, strategically upgraded. He came back with a vision that terrified every Western intelligence agency: unite oppressed peoples globally into one coordinated international movement to dismantle Western domination. He wasn't just talking to Black Americans anymore. He was thinking in terms of the entire third world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, everywhere colonialism had extracted wealth and left poverty behind. He met Che Guevara at the United Nations. He reached out to civil rights organizations he once dismissed. He began talking about working alongside progressive white allies, not as saviors, but as participants in a larger war against exploitation. And his speeches near the end showed an evolution that was deadly to the status quo. By January 1965, Malcolm was openly articulating the analysis that connects everything the system tries to keep separate. You can't have capitalism without racism, because capitalism requires exploitation. And the easiest people to exploit are the people you can convince are inferior. Racism doesn't just produce hatred. It produces discounted human life, cheap labor, stolen land, low wages, brutal policing, and permanent vulnerability. Racism creates a class of people who can be squeezed harder, paid less, punished more, and blamed for it. That's why Malcolm became intolerable. Malcolm, as a separatist, could be caged in the American imagination as extremist. Malcolm, as a global human rights revolutionary exposing the architecture of capitalism and imperialism, threatened the entire Western order. Then the countdown accelerated. February 1965. On February 14th at 2:45 a.m., someone firebombed Malcolm's home while his family slept. Betty and their 4 daughters barely escaped. Flames, smoke, terror in the dark. Everyone knew what it meant. The threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It was active. And Malcolm knew the government was watching. He knew surveillance was constant. He knew informants were everywhere. And he knew there were powerful men who wanted him erased. There were reports that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wanted action taken against Malcolm X. Agencies tracked his international contacts. NYPD monitored him. The walls were closing in, and still, no one protected him. No serious security, no intervention. No meaningful response to the firebombing, just silence. Then came February 21st. Malcolm walked into the Audubon Ballroom despite knowing it was a trap. His security was compromised. His organization was under pressure. His movements were being tracked. Even his life insurance had been canceled. But he went anyway, because to Malcolm, the work was bigger than survival. Inside, there were roughly 300 people gathered. A small crowd, but enough to matter. Malcolm stepped toward the front. The atmosphere was unstable, like a room holding its breath. Around 3 p.m., someone in the crowd shouted, "Get your hand out of my pocket!" A diversion, a split-second disruption, exactly what you'd need if you wanted security distracted. As heads turned, a man stood with a sawed-off shotgun. The blast tore into Malcolm's chest, and then 2 more men surged forward, emptying pistols into him at close range. Shot after shot after shot. Fast, deliberate. 21 bullets. His daughters screamed. Betty shielded them. The crowd panicked. In the chaos, one of the attackers, Talmadge Hayer, was caught by the crowd, but 2 others vanished. And then the machinery of justice moved with the speed it never shows when black people are the victims. Police arrested Norman, 3, ex-Butler, and Thomas, 15, ex-Johnson. And in 1966, all three were convicted and sentenced to life. But even then, the story didn't fit. Hayer confessed, while insisting Butler and Johnson were innocent. He admitted Malcolm was killed with members from a Newark mosque. Butler had an alibi, home with a leg injury. A doctor testified. There was no physical evidence tying them to the murder. They convicted them anyway because the FBI and NYPD needed the case closed, fast, clean, finished. And for 42 years, 2 innocent men sat in prison while the truth was buried. Then, finally, the lie cracked. November 2021. They were exonerated, and the Manhattan DA admitted the truth. The FBI and NYPD had deliberately withheld evidence, including evidence that would have helped the defense. They protected informants instead of seeking justice, which means what people suspected for generations wasn't paranoia. It was policy. What that admission really meant was this. For decades, the official story wasn't just incomplete. It was engineered, because Malcolm had been on the government's radar long before 1965. Federal authorities tracked him for years, watching his speeches, monitoring his organizing, mapping his relationships. And law enforcement didn't treat him like a citizen with rights. They treated him like a threat that needed to be managed. Not because Malcolm was running around committing crimes, because Malcolm was producing something the state fears more than riots: awakened people. By the early 1960s, the FBI had built an entire playbook for neutralizing subversive movements. In that era, programs like COINTELPRO targeted black organizations through surveillance, infiltration, internal sabotage, rumor campaigns, pressure on employers, intimidation, and the strategic use of informants. The goal wasn't just to observe, the goal was to disrupt. Turn allies into enemies. Turn organizations into paranoia factories. Make leaders look unstable. Make unity impossible. And Malcolm was a prime target because he was becoming harder to box in. He had influence in the Nation of Islam. He had influence outside the nation. He had an international platform. And unlike many public figures, Malcolm was evolving in real time, adapting, sharpening, expanding. That kind of evolution is dangerous to a system that relies on predictable opposition. And the deeper Malcolm went into global politics, the more alarmed the intelligence world became. Meetings in Africa, conversations with heads of state, plans to internationalize America's racism as a human rights violation, efforts to bring U.S. hypocrisy to the United Nations. That's not civil rights leader territory anymore. That's geopolitical. So when the assassination happened, a lot of people looked at the scene and asked the same question. How does a man with this many threats, this much surveillance, and this much state attention end up murdered in a public ballroom with police nearby, and the killers still get away? Even Malcolm's supporters weren't shocked that someone tried. They were shocked the system didn't stop it, because by then, everybody knew something was coming. The firebombing of his home on February 14th wasn't a random incident. It was a warning, a rehearsal, a test. And if law enforcement had wanted to prevent what happened next, that moment gave them the justification to act. But they didn't. Then on February 21st, the security situation was compromised. People close to Malcolm had been infiltrated. The room itself was vulnerable. And later, Reporting and investigations would raise serious questions about informants and undercover presence in and around Malcolm's circles. When bullets flew, there were long-standing claims that officers were present and failed to intervene effectively. Claims that have fueled public outrage for generations because the larger pattern fits what we already know the government was doing to black movements at the time: infiltrating, destabilizing, and neutralizing. And here's the key point Malcolm's enemies never understood. They thought the danger was Malcolm's anger. It wasn't. The danger was Malcolm's clarity. Malcolm didn't just teach people to resist. He taught people to understand. He connected dots. Americans are trained not to connect. Police brutality at home is connected to colonial brutality abroad. Racism isn't just prejudice. It's a structure that protects wealth and power. The global system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. If you want real liberation, you can't just beg the system to be nicer. You have to build power outside of it. And once Malcolm began reaching beyond America, once he started building a coalition that made U.S. racism a global liability, his existence became a problem that couldn't be solved with bad press. That's when the target moved from contain him to remove him. So yes, the government didn't have to be the gunman to benefit from Malcolm's death. They just had to ensure the conditions were in place for it to happen, and then ensure the truth stayed buried afterward. And that's exactly what the 2021 exonerations exposed. Not just a wrongful conviction, but a justice system willing to protect itself before it protects truth. 2 men lost 42 years of their lives. Families were destroyed. History was distorted. And the public was fed a clean narrative so the machinery could keep turning. But even in death, Malcolm kept winning, because his ideas didn't die in the Audubon Ballroom. They multiplied. Within years, his philosophy surged through the Black Power movement. His speeches became blueprints. His name became a symbol not just of resistance, but of transformation. He proved something simple and terrifying. A mind can be liberated. A man can evolve. A person the system labels criminal can become a world figure, capable of shifting how millions see themselves and their enemy. That's why his legacy is still treated like a controlled substance, because Malcolm's message was never mainly about him. It was about what happens when people stop accepting the story they were given. The autobiography of Malcolm X spread around the world. Students, prisoners, organizers, workers, people who'd never met him felt like they did, because his story wasn't a biography. It was a warning and a key. Freedom isn't given, it's taken. Truth isn't negotiated, it's spoken. And mental liberation isn't optional. It's everything. And 60 years later, that analysis is still more dangerous to the system than any weapon, because weapons can be confiscated. But once an idea is planted in a liberated mind, it doesn't go back in the cage. And if you're thinking, okay, but how do we know they buried it? Because the lie didn't just live in rumors. It lived in paperwork. It lived in files. It lived in the way the case was handled from day one. Look at what happened right after the murder. They didn't launch a serious manhunt for the full team. They didn't publicly tear apart every lead. They didn't treat it like the assassination of one of the most important black leaders in American history. They treated it like a fire that needed to be put out fast before it spread. So they grabbed a story that could be wrapped up clean and they stapled names to it. Talmadge Hayer was caught at the scene. That part is real. The crowd stopped him. He was injured. He was arrested. And if the system had actually wanted the full truth, That arrest was a gift because a captured shooter is a doorway to the whole operation. But instead of following that doorway, they built a wall. Hare later confessed, again and again, that Butler and Johnson were innocent. He said he did it with other men connected to a Newark mosque. He described the plot. He pointed away from the two men who would spend decades behind bars, and still the state refused to move. Why? Because if you admit you convicted the wrong people, you have to explain what you were doing while the real network operated. You have to explain surveillance, informants, infiltration, prior warnings. You have to explain why the agencies that claim to know everything somehow missed the biggest thing. So they didn't miss it. They managed it. This is how cover-ups work in real life. Not with movie villains twirling mustaches, but with institutions protecting themselves through paperwork, silence, and controlled outcomes. And here's what makes it worse. The prosecution's case against Butler and Johnson was thin, no clean physical evidence, strong reasons to doubt, alibis that should have mattered, testimony that should have shaken the courtroom. But the machine needed closure because Malcolm X dead was already a crisis. Malcolm X dead plus a public investigation exposing informants and agency behavior would have been a disaster. So they chose the option that protects the system every time. Convict someone, close the file, control the narrative, and then, for decades, they let the world live inside that false closure. Meanwhile, Malcolm's family lived with the reality, knowing he'd been threatened, knowing he'd been watched, knowing he'd been targeted, and still watching the state act like it was all just tragic. And the bigger truth is, Malcolm's murder didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in an America that was systematically targeting black leadership. This was the era when civil rights workers were being surveilled, when organizers were being beaten and arrested, when churches were being bombed, when law and order was code for keeping black people politically powerless. And it was the era when the government perfected a strategy that doesn't always require direct murder. Sometimes all you do is infiltrate movements, amplify internal conflict, isolate key leaders, remove protection, and then let street-level forces do what you pretend you're trying to stop. That's why Malcolm's final year is so important. Because once he left the Nation of Islam, he wasn't just exposed ideologically, he was exposed physically. The split made him vulnerable. The surveillance made him predictable. The threats made him exhausted. And the state knew all of it. People loved to reduce Malcolm to slogans, by any means necessary, ballot or bullet. But his real threat in 1964 to 1965 was deeper. He was starting to unify streams of struggle that were never meant to connect. He was bridging the gap between black nationalism and global anti-colonial revolution, religious identity and political strategy, domestic oppression and international law, black liberation and class exploitation. He was turning scattered pain into organized analysis, and once you give people analysis, they stop being manageable. Because a person with analysis doesn't just react, they plan. They don't just march, they build. They don't just ask for inclusion, they question the legitimacy of the whole structure. That's why Malcolm's human rights shift matters so much. It wasn't soft. It was a tactical upgrade. Civil rights keeps you begging the same government that's hurting you to be nicer. Human rights puts that government on trial in front of the world, and the U.S. could survive accusations from its own black citizens. It had survived that for centuries, but it could not risk a global stage where newly independent African nations plus Asia and Latin America could align and say, America is not a democracy, it's an empire. Because Malcolm wasn't just asking for change. He was building the case that America's racism was not an internal flaw. It was a feature of empire. And that's when Malcolm became a problem bigger than any one agency. Now here's the part people still underestimate. Malcolm didn't just leave ideas behind, he left momentum. Even after the assassination, people who never considered themselves political started seeing what he was pointing at. Young organizers began reading him like scripture. Prisoners held onto his words like oxygen. Students copied his speeches, memorized his interviews, debated his strategy like it was a blueprint for survival. And the state understood that too. That's why the narrative had to be controlled. If Malcolm is remembered as a violent extremist, then his death looks like tragedy. If Malcolm is remembered as a global human rights strategist exposing capitalism and imperialism, then his death looks like elimination. So they tried to freeze him in the most convenient version of himself. They wanted early Malcolm, stuck in a box. They didn't want final Malcolm, expanding into something unstoppable, because final Malcolm was the kind of leader who could have linked Black America to a worldwide block of oppressed nations and movements. And once that happens, you're no longer dealing with protests. You're dealing with international pressure, economic consequences, diplomatic embarrassment, a legitimacy crisis. And that's why the cover-up wasn't just about who fired the shots. It was about preventing the public from fully understanding what Malcolm was becoming. Because if people understood what he was becoming, they'd ask the only question that matters. Who benefits from Malcolm X being dead? And when you ask that question, who benefits? The answer gets uncomfortable fast. Because Malcolm wasn't killed in some random street conflict. He wasn't a casualty of black-on-black crime. He wasn't the victim of bad luck. He was a man with documented enemies, documented surveillance, documented threats, and documented government interest. And then he was murdered in a public venue, in broad daylight, with law enforcement nearby. And the aftermath produced 2 wrongful convictions and a half-century of buried evidence. That's not chaos. That's structure. And it fits a pattern the United States has repeated again and again. When a Black leader begins to unify people beyond the boundaries the system can control, when they start connecting local oppression to national policy to global empire, pressure escalates. First they smear you, then they isolate you, then they infiltrate you, then they split your base, then, if needed, they remove you, sometimes by prison, sometimes by exile, sometimes by assassination, and sometimes by stepping aside and letting the violence happen while the state pretends it was powerless. That's why Malcolm's last months matter so much. Because by late 1964 and early 1965, Malcolm was operating in a danger zone, too influential to ignore, too independent to control, too international to contain, and too honest to co-opt. He was speaking in a way that made the government's usual tools less effective. You can co-opt a leader who only wants inclusion. You can negotiate with someone who only wants reforms. You can fund safe organizations and starve dangerous ones. But Malcolm was moving towards something the system cannot easily negotiate with, a moral indictment of the entire Western order. He wasn't just telling Black people, we deserve rights. He was telling the world, this system is built on theft. He was linking American segregation to colonial domination, police violence to military occupation, corporate profit to human suffering, and democracy to propaganda. And once you say that out loud with clarity, you start attracting allies the U.S. government does not want you to have. Newly independent African nations, anti-colonial movements in Asia, revolutionary currents in Latin America, countries eager to expose American hypocrisy at the UN. Because in the 1960s, the United States wasn't just fighting for freedom, it was fighting for global influence against the Soviet Union, against decolonization movements it couldn't fully control, and against the possibility that oppressed nations would unite and choose a path outside Western domination. Malcolm's international strategy threatened to accelerate that. And here's what makes Malcolm's story even more tragic. He wasn't reckless. He knew the danger. After leaving the Nation of Islam, he openly said he expected to die. He talked about the threats. He talked about how his phone was tapped, how he was followed, how he was under constant surveillance. He knew informants were everywhere, and still he moved forward. He founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated. He launched the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He tried to create an infrastructure that could outlive him. Because Malcolm didn't think like a celebrity. He thought like a revolutionary strategist. He wasn't trying to build a fan base. He was trying to build capacity. Capacity to educate, capacity to organize, capacity to defend communities, capacity to connect globally. But in building that capacity, he made enemies on multiple fronts at the same time. Inside the nation, the split turned bitter. Outside the nation, white media intensified demonization. Inside law enforcement, surveillance intensified. In intelligence circles, international contacts set off alarms. And by February 1965, the escalation was obvious. The firebombing of his home wasn't just violence, it was a signal. We can reach you anywhere. It wasn't an abstract threat anymore. It was a rehearsal in front of his family. It showed that whoever wanted him dead wasn't afraid of public outrage, wasn't afraid of children being harmed, wasn't afraid of consequences. And then, still, no protection. No serious investigation that changed the situation. No meaningful prevention. No visible urgency from the institutions that claim they exist to keep order. Which brings us back to that ballroom. If the state truly wanted Malcolm alive, February 21st could have been prevented in multiple ways. If authorities truly wanted justice, the investigation could have unfolded differently. If the system truly valued truth, it wouldn't have fought so hard to keep key evidence hidden for decades. But the system didn't behave like it wanted prevention. It behaved like it wanted containment. Contain the public anger, contain the political fallout, contain the investigation, contain the narrative. And that's why two innocent men were so useful, because wrongful convictions don't just punish the innocent, they protect the guilty, they seal the file, they end the questions, they give the public closure, they let institutions move on, and they turn history into a bedtime story, tragic but solved. But Malcolm's story didn't stay solved because people kept digging. Researchers, journalists, activists, and Malcolm's family kept pushing, kept refusing the official narrative, kept pointing out the holes. And those holes were too big to patch forever. That's what finally cracked in 2021. When the Manhattan DA's office acknowledged the withholding of evidence, it wasn't just an apology. It was an admission that the system did not prioritize justice in a case where justice would have exposed the system, which means the real story is bigger than Malcolm's assassination. It's about what happens when a man exposes the wiring behind the wall, when he shows people how power actually works. Because Malcolm didn't just criticize racism as a moral failure. He treated racism as a tool to divide workers, a tool to justify exploitation, a tool to police borders of belonging, a tool to protect wealth. And once you understand racism as a tool, you stop arguing with it like it's just ignorance. You start organizing against the people who benefit from it. That's why Malcolm's ideas were, and still are, so dangerous. Not because they make people angry, because they make people clear. And clarity is what turns grief into strategy, because when you truly understand what happened to Malcolm, you stop treating his murder like an isolated event, and you start seeing it as the end point of a long campaign, a campaign that began before he was born, a campaign that followed him through childhood, a campaign that shaped his choices, cornered him, caged him, and then watched him become too powerful to ignore. That's why his story is so important. It proves the system isn't just biased, it's engineered. Look at Malcolm's life like a timeline of American power. White terror forces his family to flee. A home is burned to the ground. A father is killed and the state calls it an accident. Insurance is denied. Poverty is enforced. A mother is declared insane and removed. Children are scattered into foster systems. A gifted student is told his dream is impossible because he's black. He drops out, enters the underground economy. The state hits him with an extreme sentence. Prison turns him into an intellectual weapon. He emerges as a leader. The state surveils and infiltrates. Internal fractures are amplified. He evolves into an international threat. A home is firebombed. A public assassination happens with warning and watchers. 2 innocent men are locked up. Evidence is buried. That is not random. That is what domination looks like when it wants to appear normal, and it explains why Malcolm's message hit so hard, because it wasn't theory to him. It was lived reality. When Malcolm spoke about white power, he wasn't speaking from imagination. He was speaking from memory. He had watched institutions treat violence against his family as paperwork. He had watched law operate like a mask for control. He had watched the difference between what America claims and what America does. That's why, when Malcolm became a leader, he didn't ask for permission. He didn't believe in appealing to the conscience of an empire built on conquest. He believed you had to build power, because conscience without power is just a plea. And when he broadened his framework from civil rights to human rights, it wasn't just a rhetorical shift. It was a direct threat to the U.S. government's international image. Because in the Cold War era, America sold itself to the world as the leader of freedom against tyranny. That was the brand. And Malcolm was exposing that brand as marketing. He was saying, how can you preach freedom in Berlin while denying freedom in Birmingham? How can you condemn oppression abroad while practicing oppression at home? If that argument spreads globally, especially among newly independent nations, America loses moral authority. And when an empire loses moral authority, it starts losing influence. That's why Malcolm's Africa trips set off alarms. Not because he was meeting people, because he was building a block. He was linking Black America to international currents that could create diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, and political fallout. He was trying to make U.S. racism costly. And that's when the state's relationship to Malcolm shifts from monitoring to managing the outcome. Because even if you can't stop a man from speaking, you can stop him from organizing at scale. Even if you can't erase his ideas, you can interrupt his momentum. Even if you can't kill the message, You can kill the messenger and force everyone else into fear. That's why the assassination wasn't just about Malcolm. It was about the lesson, a lesson broadcast to every organizer watching. This is what happens when you go too far. But here's the twist the state never fully anticipated. Malcolm's death didn't end the movement. It sped it up, because martyrdom has its own power. And when people see a leader killed, it forces a decision. Either you retreat into safety or you realize safety was always an illusion. And for a generation, Malcolm's death pushed people into the second option. His ideas showed up everywhere, in Black Power politics, in prison organizing, in student movements, in anti-imperialist frameworks, in international solidarity struggles. People didn't just mourn him, they studied him. They studied his evolution, from street hustler to disciplined scholar, from religious nationalist to global human rights strategist. They studied the way he admitted mistakes, adjusted, learned, sharpened, because that evolution is what made him relatable and dangerous. Malcolm proved you could change, you could wake up, you could rebuild your mind. And that's the one thing oppression cannot afford for the oppressed to believe. Because once people believe transformation is possible, they stop accepting their assigned role. That's why Malcolm remains one of the most feared voices in American history, even decades after his death. Not because people like him, because his words still perform an action on the listener. They break mental chains. And that's why the system still tries to keep his legacy boxed into a caricature. They want Malcolm reduced to a furious quote on a poster. They want him frozen as Angry Malcolm, because Angry Malcolm can be dismissed. What they don't want is Strategic Malcolm, the Malcolm who understood media is a battlefield, language is a weapon, international law is leverage, coalition is power, and empire survives by dividing the oppressed. Because if people meet that Malcolm, the Malcolm in his final year, the question becomes impossible to avoid. If he was evolving into a global human rights leader, if he was building international pressure, if he was linking racism to capitalism and imperialism, then how random was his death? And how innocent was the state's role in allowing it to happen? Because the truth Malcolm lived and the truth his death revealed is simple. The system doesn't always need to commit the crime. Sometimes it just needs to guarantee the outcome. And once you see that, once you understand how outcomes are guaranteed, you start recognizing the technique. The technique is not always a single dramatic act. It's a chain of choices, a chain of omissions, a chain of decisions made behind closed doors that, when added together, produce one clean result. The person becomes impossible to keep alive. That's why Malcolm's final stretch reads like a man walking through a hallway of open traps. He was receiving threats constantly. He was being followed. He was being watched. He was being isolated. And the scariest part is this: Malcolm didn't just suspect it. He talked about it publicly. He warned people that his phone was tapped. He warned people that informants were in the room. He warned people he was marked. And he wasn't saying it for drama. He was saying it because he could see the pressure pattern tightening. That's why he kept moving anyway, because Malcolm wasn't naive about what he was up against. In his mind, the United States wasn't just a country with racism. It was a system that needed racism, a global power structure that required exploitation to stay rich and required lies to stay legitimate. So he treated his work like an emergency because he knew time wasn't on his side. He didn't have the luxury of a long career. He was building something meant to outlive him. That's what the Organization of Afro-American Unity was about. Not just speeches, but structure. Not just outrage, but programs. Not just identity, but international alignment. He was trying to do something that almost no leader gets the chance to do. Build an organization with enough clarity and discipline to survive after the founder is gone. Because Malcolm understood a truth movements learn the hard way. If the entire movement is tied to one man, then killing the man can cripple the movement. So Malcolm was trying to spread leadership, spread education, spread strategy, so that if he fell, the work wouldn't. But again, this is where the danger to the state multiplies. A charismatic leader is dangerous. A charismatic leader who is building durable infrastructure is terrifying. Because infrastructure means your message becomes permanent. And Malcolm's message, by 1965, wasn't just black pride. It was a complete indictment. The U.S. government condemns oppression abroad while practicing it at home. American capitalism enriches itself by exploiting the marginalized. Racism is not an accidental sickness. It is a maintained tool. Human rights are the real battlefield, not civil rights. International solidarity is leverage. Western power is upheld by violence, police violence at home and military violence abroad. And he was saying all of this while actively forging relationships with leaders overseas. That's why it's important to understand the era. The U.S. wasn't just fighting communism, it was fighting the possibility of a unified third world that would reject Western control. It was fighting the possibility that Africa would become truly independent, not just politically, but economically. It was fighting the possibility that global South nations would nationalize resources, control their own development, and align against Western corporate interests. And Malcolm, an American citizen, was building bridges right into that world. That's an intelligence nightmare. So the question becomes, what would it look like to neutralize a man like that without creating a bigger scandal? Because assassinating him directly would risk making him a martyr, and it would risk exposure. But stepping aside, allowing internal enemies to do the work, creates plausible deniability. The state can say, it was an internal conflict. It was extremist. It was a tragedy. It was out of our hands. And that's the brilliance of the technique. You don't just remove the man, you remove accountability. Then you cap it off with wrongful convictions. Wrongful convictions don't just close a case, they protect the larger system by reducing complexity. Instead of the public asking who planned it, who infiltrated, who knew, who warned who, the public is handed a simple story. 3 guys did it. We caught 'em. Case closed. And then time does the rest. Because time is the friend of cover-ups. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Documents disappear. Public attention shifts. And decades later, people will argue about it like it's a mystery instead of a deliberate outcome. But Malcolm's story refused to stay buried because there were always too many contradictions. Why were Butler and Johnson convicted with weak evidence? Why did Hare consistently say they were innocent? Why didn't authorities pursue the other men he named? Why was crucial evidence withheld? Why were informants protected? Why did it take so long for the truth to crack open? Those questions never fully went away, and that's why 2021 matters so much. Because when the Manhattan DA acknowledged the withholding of evidence, it wasn't just a legal correction, it was a historical alarm. It was the system accidentally admitting the part it always tries to hide. We knew more than we told you. We had information we didn't share. We protected sources instead of justice. And that admission changes how you see everything. It forces you to look back at that ballroom with new eyes. It forces you to look at the firebombing with new eyes. It forces you to look at the arrests with new eyes. Because once you accept the state was hiding evidence, the next question is unavoidable. If they were hiding evidence after the assassination, what were they doing before it? And if they had warning, surveillance, informants, and eyes everywhere, then the line between failed to prevent and allowed to happen becomes razor thin. That's why people say they didn't have to kill him. They just stepped aside. Because that's exactly how power operates when it wants the outcome but doesn't want the fingerprints. And here's the final layer that most people miss. Malcolm's assassination didn't just remove a leader. It removed a bridge between domestic black struggle and global revolution, a bridge between American racism and international human rights law, a bridge between anger and strategy, a bridge that could have united movements that were never supposed to coordinate. And once that bridge was gone, the struggle inside America became easier to compartmentalize, easier to manage, easier to negotiate, easier to delay. That's why Malcolm's death was so useful to the status quo, because Malcolm alive was escalation. Malcolm dead was containment, and that's the part they hoped time would erase. Malcolm alive was a moving target. Malcolm dead was a fixed story, a story they could package, a story they could simplify, a story they could teach without teaching the reason. Because if the public ever fully understood what Malcolm was doing in 1964 to 1965, if they understood that he was trying to internationalize black struggle as a human rights case, then his assassination stops looking like an internal dispute and starts looking like something far bigger, a leader being neutralized right as he builds global leverage. And that's why the aftermath matters as much as the bullets. Two innocent men were convenient because they closed the door on deeper questions. They served as a human padlock on the truth. Their lives were the cost of institutional protection, because if the case stayed open long enough, the spotlight would eventually land where the state didn't want it: informants, surveillance, withheld reports, and the agencies that knew too much. But history has a way of resurfacing what power tries to bury. When those exonerations happened in 2021, it wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was the system quietly admitting what people had screamed for generations. Justice was never the priority. Control was. And the most chilling part is this: Malcolm's death wasn't the end of the war he was fighting. It was proof of it. Because Malcolm was never dangerous because he was violent. He was dangerous because he taught millions to see the world as it is, without the propaganda lens. He taught people that racism is not simply hatred, it's policy. He taught people that poverty is not personal failure, it's design. He taught people that law and order can be the language of occupation. He taught people that the U.S. could not preach freedom abroad while crushing it at home without being exposed. And he taught the most revolutionary lesson of all: you can rebuild yourself. You can free your mind. You can stop asking the system to approve your humanity. That's why his story keeps returning. Because once a person hears Malcolm at full power, once they hear the final Malcolm, the internationalist, the human rights strategist, the mind starts asking questions that don't go away. Who benefits from your silence? Who profits from your confusion? Who needs you divided, ashamed, and exhausted. And that's why Malcolm's words still cut through the noise 6 decades later. They killed the man in the Audubon Ballroom, but the idea survived the bullets. Because you can arrest a body, you can cage a body, you can bury a body. But when people achieve mental liberation, when they learn to name the machine and see its gears, you can't undo that with a gun. Malcolm's message is still here, still dangerous, still alive. Freedom isn't handed down, it's taken. Truth isn't granted, it's spoken. And liberation starts where fear ends, inside the mind. And here's the cold part. Malcolm didn't need a single agency to pull the trigger for the system to win. In the 1960s, black movements were surveilled, infiltrated, and destabilized. Leaders monitored, organizations split, informants protected. Malcolm warned he was being watched. His home was firebombed. Then he was killed in public. For decades, the case was closed while major questions stayed open. And in 2021, the Manhattan DA's office acknowledged that key evidence had been withheld, evidence that should have been disclosed, while 2 men lost 42 years of their lives. That isn't a rumor. That's on the record. So whether you call it negligence, sabotage, or something darker, the lesson is the same. Power protects itself first. Malcolm's threat was never just anger, it was clarity. He taught people to see the machine, name it, and organize against it. They ended the man. They didn't end the message, because once a mind is free, it doesn't go back in the cage.